Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. You know, you make some memes, some jokes about how corrupt and degenerate the deep state is, the people who are running this country, the people who are operating the eternal bureaucracy that is watching over us at every turn. How could they be any more evil than you think they already are? And then a story like this breaks. Chris Rufo dropped a bomb yesterday that he and a few other investigative journalists had obtained leaked information that the American intelligence community was operating a secret trans sex chat across several different agencies, including the NSA and the CIA, in which they discussed all kinds of things like who they hated, who they were looking to undermine, what kind of sex acts they were going to perform on each other, and probably the grossest of all, the children that they could ultimately groom to fall into the lifestyle that they were perpetuating. Tulsi Gabbard has already taken action with this information. We're going to dive into all of that. And joining me today to discuss this absolutely Jerry Springer-esque situation is Jay Burden. Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on again, Auron. I enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite a strange topic to be discussing today, but sadly, nothing that I think ultimately surprises us, though perhaps the dark depths were even worse than we suggested.
Well, definitely, right? Like if you've been on the internet for any amount of time, there's a certain amount of degeneracy you almost get used to, right? You know, furries were the most shocking thing in the world once you found out about them, but 10 years later, it barely even, registers a response. And then this is, well above and beyond, I think, what any of us would have expected. I mean, I think all of us, particularly on the right wing, have made derogatory comments about federal agents from time to time, the idea of the feds. And then you see what they're actually up to. And it's not quite Jason Bourne, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, that's quite the understatement. Well, we're going to dive into all of the horrific details on this. But before we do, let me tell you about today's sponsor. There's a shocking amount of personal info about you and your family publicly available online. Your current and past addresses, phone numbers, emails, relatives, and more. If you haven't signed up for Patriot Protect or a similar service, all of this is searchable on hundreds of websites, and it leaves you and your loved ones open to identity theft, fraud, harassment, and worse. Scam calls aren't random. They're targeted attacks that use this exposed info to profile you and take aim at you. Scammers take your name, number, and details to break through your defenses. Changing your name, phone, or email doesn't stop it. And that's why you need to stop it at the source. That's where Patriot Protect comes in. Patriot Protect stops threats at the source by erasing your personal data from the internet, data you never agreed to share. By cutting off access to scammers, criminals, robocalls, and debt collectors, you'll be secure, private, and in control. Patriot Protect Search and Destroy protocol scans and removes personal information from over 100 data broker sites, the sites scammers and criminals rely on. Once the cleanup is done, they continuously monitor and eliminate any new instances of your data appearing online. That's 24/7 protection for about $5 a month. You can use the promo code Auron for 15% off of a yearly subscription. Just head to patriotprotect.com/Auron. Again, that's the promo code Auron at patriotprotect.com/Auron. All right, guys. Well, I'm sure you've heard that all of this is just a right-wing conspiracy theory. That certainly there aren't a bunch of perverts at the top levels of government operation. They're not riddling the entire infrastructure of American government. They're not in charge and coordinating together to go ahead and defile young children. Like, none of that can be real. It's all in your head. It's all crazy internet conspiracy theory. Oh, wait. I guess it's been a few months, so obviously that right-wing conspiracy theory is now just a mainstream media headline. It's just a provable reality that everyone could have intuited from the behavior of our elite class, but now is something we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. So let's dive in a little bit to Chris Rufo's thread here, and we'll react as we go. It says exclusive. He and Hannah Grossman have obtained the logs from an NSA secret transgender sex chat room in which NSA, CIA, and DIA employees discuss genital castration, artificial vaginas, piss fetishes, sex polycules, gangbangs, and all on government time. YouTube, I just want to make it clear, I am just reading the news, okay? I'm
Auron,
not, I'm not responsible for the content of this news.
Where could you imagine just reading out that sentence to yourself 10 years ago and saying this will be a piece of news? Just that exact literal sentence.
I am a journalistic professional just doing my job, right? Like that's this is insane. Again, it's everything we suspected, it's everything we joked about, it's everything that we could have intuited from the kind of people who are operating our government. But yeah, it is still a little surreal to be like, in the course of being a straight news program, like not comedy, we're not doing the Daily Show here, we still have to read these sentences. It's just absolutely insane. So Rufo says, the NSA maintains a chat system for the intelligence community called Interlink. The servers are supposed to be used for government work, but the gender activists have hijacked at least two channels, the LGBTQA. Who could have seen that these were the two channels and the Pride one? How could these two channels of all channels be the ones that were hijacked in this scenario to discuss fetishes, kinks, sex, and all legitimized as DEI? Here, the little snippet from his own work. He says, according to our sources, sex chats were legitimized as part of the NSA's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Activities within the agency activists within the agency used LGBTQ plus employee resource groups to turn their kinks and pathologies into official work duty. According to the current NSA employees, these groups spent all day recruiting activists and holding meetings with titles such as privilege, ally awareness, pride, transgender community inclusion, and they did so with the full support of NSA leadership, which declared that DEI was not only mission critical, but mission imperative. So to be clear, we already know, right? The original story about kind of wokeness, DEI, all this stuff was that it was only going to touch the soft sciences, right? It would be in sociology or psychology. It would take over these departments in colleges, but it would never make its way into, say, the military or into medicine, any of these critical aspects of our society. It certainly wouldn't alter the way that doctors address their patients in a scenario in which biology is critical, that kind of stuff. But knowing that now it pardon the term, penetrated beyond that and into the intelligence community where literally lives are on the line, right? We are told that these people are doing absolutely critical work to keep the nation safe from terroristic threats. That's why it's so dangerous for Donald Trump or someone else to mess with the employees there, because clearly all these people are just super dedicated civil servants who are only interested in the safety of the United States and the people of the United States. And in reality, they're all just spending all day, like they're not doing their jobs. Instead, they're recruiting. They're recruiting for more people to join their transgender chat so they can talk about their sexual fetishes all day online. This is how they're spending their day at work. Yeah, you're sending pictures of cats on Instagram, but it's much, much worse when it comes to national security.
Well, and this is something that, you know, many thinkers in the kind of same general area as we have discussed, right? Whether you want to look at the concept of bio-Leninism or the rather crudely named Tranessary meme, you know, there is something to this, right? That the people who have most fully swallowed left-wing ideology are literal pawns of power, right? They get, as part of their deal, right? They get privileges you and I don't get, right? If you and I in the private sector spent all day talking about similar things, we would not have jobs for very long, right? And for a very long time, up until recently, that was something government employees did not have to face, right? They seemingly could sit around all day and talk about their genital preferences, you know, talk about these kind of like weird, perverse things. And, you know, not only would that get you and I a meeting with HR, but we wouldn't have a job, right?
Well,
and only
so sorry to interrupt, but we should be really clear here. you probably could get away with talking about exactly these things. You just couldn't get away if you were doing it while heterosexual, right?
Yes,
Like it's
exactly.
literally the heterosexuality of the discussion of these topics that would get you in trouble. If you were discussing these topics, then much like these agents, you would be part of the DEI coalition. This would be mission critical discussions. So it in a way really is straight up state mandated homosexuality in this in the Sam Hyde joke, because if you were discussing that version of sexual preference and what you would do to each other and how you would do it, that's all just work time. That's that's critical to the job of the National Security Agency or the Central Intelligence Agency. But if you were a heterosexual man discussing any of this, yeah, you would absolutely be nuked from orbit.
Well, and there's there's another layer to this, right? That these are not simply ostensibly useless make work jobs, right? In every movie and every television show, we are assured that these agencies are on the bleeding edge, right, of the fight against terrorism and organized crime. And yet, anytime there's some sort of mass casualty event, we learn that, well, he was on our radar, but there's nothing we can do, which has prompted many to ask the question, well, what are you doing? And it turns out the answer is basically just holding like weird role play on like a knockoff Discord server.
Well, and the reason that all these trans shooters were probably on their radar is they were probably inviting them to the chat rooms. Like
I was about to say.
That's the reason that they know who these people are, because they're probably networking directly with the very like insane degenerates that are murdering people, and they don't want to like rat out their buddy because they're hoping at some point they can put a move on him or something, right? So like we're joking, but like people have been murdered in relation to this kind of stuff, and sadly, like we don't know how much of our jokes are actually applicable in this scenario. As you just pointed out, we're constantly told that it's incredibly dangerous for Trump to get in there and overturn the bureaucracy. And how could you mess with all of these objective civil servants who are just working for the good of the people? This is, this is what a dictatorship looks like. This is the end of democracy. When they say that Trump is a threat to our democracy, they literally mean the trans chat rooms in which they're grooming children. That is the democracy that Donald Trump is a threat to. And that's not speculation or a meme that I made up that went viral. That is literally what the reporting reveals about our intelligence community.
Right, exactly. And it's sort of an interesting thing, right? If you look into that term democracy, like many things in modern discourse, it has a literal dictionary definition and then the kind of working definition. And the working definition basically seems to be how much homosexual activity your organization pays for and endorses, right?
Yeah.
So you have countries where someone is, dutifully elected, right, due to the, a relatively acceptable degree of security. But if they don't approve of, and I'm speaking very delicately here, they don't approve of non-traditional sexual relationships, well, that's a dangerous dictator, right? That's not real democracy. And it's kind of convenient when someone just says it so quickly, says it so easily. It's like, why do we have to analyze this? You're just saying this, right? But this story is patently ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, I will just go through some of the degeneracy. I apologize in advance. Normally, I don't dwell on this stuff, but I feel like it's kind of critical at this juncture to like explain how completely insane and unhinged the people who are literally in job, whose job it is to decide if you're just going to get disappeared to a black site in the United States. Like how mentally unstable and evil these people are. The joke is it's the global American empire, right? The gay. And like we literally find out that yes, like that's not just a joke from the flags they're putting up. That is literally what is required to operate inside the system at this point. Like these guys are, it's like the old joke is you had to start taking up smoking so you could get the smoke breaks because they were institutionalized. People were incentivized. Well, the only way you can get a break on the job is to take up smoking. Well, if you want to spend all day not doing your job in, any of America's intelligence agencies, you were incentivized to become trans. Like that's actually the way to avoid doing any of the work. So, Rufo here with some of the documentation. One popular chat topic was male to female transgender surgery, which involves surgically removing the penis and turning it into an artificial vagina. And the male intelligence agents love the feeling of being penetrated and peeing on others with their pseudo vaginas. And in case you think he was making that up, you can see the redacted discussions here with the different intelligence agencies marked who are participating. And you can see, them talking about wearing leggings, peeing on each other here, penetration, just like he discussed. Just the absolute, this is not like, oh, I'm feeling kind of self-aware about trying to slide into this new identity. This is the most hardcore. And again, this is like really key. This is at the center of a lot of people choosing to engage in this type of behavior. But just the fact that this is what the intelligence agencies are discussing on work time and are encouraged to do so because this is mission critical.
Well, right, exactly. And, again, when we talk about, erasing wokeness from the military or the government, it's easy to look at that as just, part of the culture war, right? Saying these are things that we don't like, and there's certainly some validity to that. But what's very clear, right, is that this sort of ideology will overtake the entire institution, right? This is no longer an institution for spying, is an institution for gay sex, right? That takes over the whole thing. And you see that, like you said earlier, right? That it creates a set of incentives, right? Well, you can't fire me. I'm a blank activist. Well, all of a sudden, right, you've created a get out of jail free card. And sure, while I'm certain there are some people there who have legitimate gender confusion, what you've also done is you've created an unaccountable class, right? And when you add on top, the categories that require less commitment than, being trans, like, non-binary or the other kind of like weird neo-pronouns. Well, guess what? You don't even need to do anything. You don't need to do the part that, you and I might consider a little bit uncomfortable. You can just say, I'm special and you can't do anything about it. And that's your new job now.
Yeah, that level of protection, of course, again, as you point out, I've seen this everywhere. This is, why kids will embrace this ideology in school, because it actually makes them like bully proof. They know that no one can attack them or can in any way criticize them once they kind of have the shield. You see this in universities, you see this in workplaces, but now again, you see this in intelligence agencies, things that are life or death. These people are deciding, where do spies go? What information decides whether or not a train, we're going to catch somebody trying to blow up a train or shoot up a school? Are we going to try to apprehend this guy moving through some kind of international area where we can, grab him up and take him for questioning? These are all decisions that are made in these arenas. And instead of focusing on that, like, incredibly important work, as we can see here, we got individuals discussing whether or not they're going to get their butthole lasered. They're going to get their fake, trans boobs grabbed. How much is it going to cost them to get these different, experimental surgeries done? This is how they spend their time. And very importantly here, let me see. Some polycule talk, of course. What would it be without that? But what we also will see is that a lot of these people were explicitly discussing their intentions of undermining the Trump administration, how they hate Tulsi Gabbard, they hate Donald Trump, they hate all these different actors who are supposed to come in and clean this up. So this isn't just a hive of scum and villainy, a place for degenerates to gather. It's also specifically a fifth column inside the intelligence agencies who are rallying around this identity in particular as a place in which they will then strike out and push back against the duly elected government of the United States.
Well, exactly. Right. And it just goes to show, right, that these are not isolated trends, right? The kind of like extreme gender ideology is in and of its core political, right? That is how they view things. That is a political identity. And, you see that in, how often these things are correlated with, extreme far left ideology, right? It's the same root idea of basically, I get to decide, right? I get to decide what happens to my body. I get to decide, what it is appropriate for me to do in a sexual context, right? It's this kind of like extreme, liberationist view of the world. Right. And so when you look at, and these clips kind of go around on social media, right, of some kind of like, religious figure who's got every, left-wing symbol under the sun all at once. And in some ways, they're mutually contradictory. But, this really is, it's a religion, right? It's a comprehensive ideology that gives you this kind of like guiding principle to go towards. And again, right, if we're talking about democracy, right, democracy doesn't mean, who's actually elected, because Donald Trump was elected. It means this kind of like nebulous like group of, special identities and privileges that must be preserved above all else. And so you can have someone out of one side of their mouth talking about respecting democracy, and out of the other say, and we have to resist Donald Trump at every turn. Again, right, it's very clearly completely, incoherent from one perspective, but, really these people are religious zealots, right? It's why that term transseries has caught, gained so much ground. These people are the ideological foot soldiers of the regime. They have taken it to the, the most extreme case you can, which is, self-mutilation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They've shown that's the final measure of devotion, basically, until the true final measure of devotion. They've gone as far as you possibly can without that one. And ultimately, you see that these guys, because they have created this scenario in which they truly believe that their entire identity, the one that they mutilated their body for radically, is only defensible in a scenario in which progressives have hegemonic power. They rightly treat the entrance of Trump and his duly elected cabinet and other officers as a existential threat to their lifestyle, because of course it is. Like, no one is going to let them sit around all day and chat about this kind of stuff if you don't have a wildly dedicated ideological system built into the entire civilization, not just the government, but media, business, religion, every aspect of this. And it's really interesting, you mentioned the religious aspect of this, the comparing it to the Janissaries, but the fact that every bureaucratic civilization inevitably ends up being run by eunuchs can't be a coincidence, right? This is there's a very Spenglerian cycle to the fact that like late stage empires inevitably end up being run by people who, either through their own choice or through the choice of others, end up without their genitalia. Like that's not a mistake. That there's no way that happens over and over again. And obviously there's incentives when you're in a monarchical situation. The eunuchs can't have children with the queen or the royal daughters or anything, so they're safe to be around women, that kind of stuff. That's why they tend to be placed in these positions of power initially, because they're not a threat to the dynastic succession. But there's also a spiritual gelding that obviously kind of presents itself over and over again inside these civilizational cycles. It just cannot be a coincidence that reliably, when you have specifically a bureaucracy, it's the form in which these eunuchs inhabit, you constantly have them rise to power. And we just see that manifested once again. Hopefully that's something we're breaking out of, but I'm just fascinated by the fact that this is a reoccurring theme throughout every civilization that kind of goes through this era.
Well, definitely, right? And there's, it's no secret, right, that even, and this is going to be something difficult to say delicately, right, that same-sex attracted men do quite well in politics, right? And, this is something that's been identified for quite some time, right? You see it in the English political system as well as ours. And there's a level to this, which is basically these people have no progeny, right? They do not have their own dynasty. And so one, they're incredibly power motivated, right? Their entire, area of effect is limited to their life. but also, right, they can place their highest loyalty to an institution, right? They're not having to take time off to go to kids' soccer games. They're not worried about something other than that institution, right? And so if you're on the other end of this, right, if you're creating your ideal soldiers, you're looking for someone who doesn't have other loyalties, right? You are their primary purpose in life. And so really, it's no shock that particularly, people without children for any number of reasons, right, are strongly associated with the ideological left for exactly that reason, right? There's nothing else for them outside of, their life frame. And obviously that isn't universal, right? There are plenty of people without children who are conservative, but it is a trend, right? It's an exploitable trend. And, again, this is the most extreme case, but, we see it in action here.
No, that's a great point. We've spoken so many times on this channel about how the key to opposing the dominance of an ideology or state power is opposing spheres of influence, right? The church, the family, the community. These are the things that ultimately limit the amount of demands that the state can make on an individual, because the individual in a proper society is not an individual. They have a large network of obligations that they have to meet on a regular basis. And so there's only so much that the state can demand, because there's all these other networks that the individual has to constantly be plugged into in order to survive and find meaning and fulfill their role in society. And so they simply can't devote their entire life, their entire fortune, their entire being to an ideology, to an organization, to an operation. But the more and more that the state is able to isolate the individual, the more they're able to draw them out of those networks, the more that they're able to make them entirely dependent on the state itself and not any of these other activities inside society, like raising children or providing for parents or seeing to the needs of a church or community, the more they can completely devote themselves over, the stronger that the central government can become, the more total the state's demands can ultimately be. And what could be more total of a demand, what could be more complete of a political soldier for a cause, a complete devotion of life to one aspect of an ideology than the trans ideology? It not only, of course, fundamentally changes you for life, removes the ability to have children, removes the ability often to just, reach climax, like all kinds of horrible things that it does over a person's life to them, but it also usually makes the person a infinite patron, or a client rather, of the medical system. They're completely dependent on the flow of drugs and treatments that come in. And of course, you have to find a justification for this. Once you've made this the center of your life, you can't go back for most cases. You see all the people who tried to detransition and just the terrible difficulties that they face. And how do you explain that to parents, spouses, kids, everything else that's connected that you already, kind of sold on this change? And so, you're exactly right. You don't have the kids, you don't have the community, you don't have the church. You can become this full-on ideological soldier who does nothing but, spend your whole day sitting in a chat room talking to other people who are supposed to be safeguarding the intelligence interests of the entire United States about whether or not you're going to get your butt lasered so you can be more attractive to other trans dudes.
Well, definitely, right? And if we look at the kind of like long-term arc of liberalism, modernity, however you want to look at it, right? The way that those states have increased their power is basically by breaking social bonds, right? If you look all the way back from, the Reformation through, the French Revolution, to now, right, what you see is a series of bonds broken. Now, look, right, I happen to think that at least some of those were probably a good thing, but nonetheless, right, that is how the state's power grows, right, by getting rid of those sort of intermediary institutions. And so when we look at, how far can you take that, right? How far can you, how many barriers can you break? Well, to be honest, there really aren't many left. Right? The barrier of, what category of human you are, male or female, that's pretty basic, right? That's pretty far down the list. Similarly, right? One of the reasons that, we see so many of these trans advocates going after children, right? As they did in these chat logs, right? Well, certainly there's just a level of base sexual perversion there, right? I don't want to, overly intellectualize this, but also that is one of the very few sacred bonds left. right? That is one of the very few bonds that you can't really, at least in some circles, touch, right? It's still sacred. But there's that desire to keep going and keep going and keep going. And while there certainly is, an ideological backing, I doubt any, radical trans activist would say, I want to break down the parent-child barrier to increase the power of the state, right? But that is in effect what they are doing, right? That is the effect of their actions and beliefs. And again, right, when our nation's ideology is this kind of woke nonsense, it's no surprise that the people, closest to the center of power, right, or at least one center of power, right, the intelligence community, well, they're rotten to the core with it, right? That is kind of the currency of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, let's just take a look here. I mean, as you say, it's both. It's not rocket science. These people do indeed have a specific proclivity, even though they deny it. But at the same time, it also creates this structure in which they're breaking down those final barriers, those final bonds, as you were talking about, the few things that stand between the average person and the total state. And so, they, like you said, they probably wouldn't announce that that's their purpose, but obviously that's a consequence of what they're doing here. And Rufo in this tweet, lays out that part of the chat. He says, NSA and CIA officials expressed their desire to have hermaphrodite babies in order to advance trans ideology. An intersex birth would be a great opportunity to raise a kid as non-binary and let them choose. These are the people who run the surveillance state. They are insane. You can see here in the chat what he's talking about. How are you raised equals how you will be. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you're 100% the results of your experiences. That does not mean the way that you're raised will be the way that you turned out. So they're talking about nature versus nurture in the context of their own, transsexuality. And then they talk about how an intersex birth would be a great opportunity to raise a kid as non-binary, and, just have them not choose at all, ever. And so, we're already talking about how can we get children and raise them in this ideological understanding. And then they're trying to discuss the difference between hermaphrodite and intersex here. So you can see that, this is the level that the chats went to as they're discussing this. Now, this has ultimately resulted in action by Tulsi Gabbard, who was recently confirmed as the director of national intelligence. And she has said that they are already firing more than 100 intelligence officers across 15 different agencies for being involved in this chat. Now, hopefully this goes further. Honestly, these guys probably were involved in criminal behavior if they were doing this on agency time. This isn't the UCMJ. I don't think that applies to intelligence officers. The Uniform Code of Military Conduct. So I'm not sure that dereliction of duty is itself a criminal offense. However, if these guys were recruiting other activists and pulling people away from, again, mission critical operations to have these kind of discussions and encourage this kind of grooming and others in these chat rooms, I've got a feeling that somewhere someone committed a very serious crime, not just slacking off at work.
I mean, maybe this is wrong to say. I don't really care which law this technically breaks. I want it to go away. I don't think that our intelligence officers should be doing this.
My politics is whatever makes this stop.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe that's a low IQ take. But at a certain point, right? If we're constantly assured, that anytime something bad happens, there's nothing that could be done, right? We have the best intelligence service in the world. And then when we get one very small view into what's going on and we see this nonsense, right? I think it's a very understandable reaction to say, well, I'm sorry, you don't get to do that. That's not appropriate. That wouldn't be appropriate if you had some, relatively unimportant job. Pick your poison of, jobs where you probably could sit around and talk about this all day. I don't think that I, as a taxpayer, should be forced to pay for this under the auspices of keeping me safe, because it very clearly has nothing to do with that. And also, this is not really a minor point, but it's gross and weird Like, I feel like that doesn't need to be said, but I don't want to support this.
It should be actually more emphasized. I'm with you on this. Like, we're definitely going with the I don't care, Margaret. I don't want these people in my government, right? Like, I don't care if there's a specific law. I don't care if there's a specific regulation. Obviously, these people should not be anywhere near like anyone. Like, they shouldn't be near other human beings, but they certainly should not be near any kind of power. And so it's okay to acknowledge that. Like, you actually don't need to be ashamed or find some kind of, third rationale for which you can justify what are entirely reasonable, expectations for human behavior. That said, I wanted to pivot a little bit and discuss, how revelations like this work, because so obviously this is important. This should come out no matter what. Right. Obviously, like, this is horrible. This would be big news no matter what, from Rufo here. However, it's not a mistake that these stories are coming out in tandem with attempts to dismantle the deep state. Right. A large amount of what Trump has to do in order to be successful for conservatives, Republicans, the right wing to ultimately win real victory, as we've discussed over and over again, is the dismantling of the administrative state. It is so central. I've written books about this. I've done videos about this. Everybody who's in our circles has talked about this ad nauseum. It's now broken through into the mainstream, that this is important. And so everyone understands to some extent or another that this is the critical thing if you actually want to make change. It's not just winning the election. It's breaking down these institutions and organizations. And of course, the left is screaming bloody murder as you do so. Oh, this is the end of democracy. This is totalitarianism. This is Orange Hitler, blah, blah, blah. But if you are revealing simultaneously, just like they did with the US aid stuff, right? You can't take down foreign aid. Starving, children in Africa aren't getting their AIDS medication. And then you point out, like, actually, no, this money is going to, like, fund atheism in Nepal or trans comic books in Colombia or Peru or whatever. Same thing here, right? Oh, how can you attack the intelligence agency? How can you be firing bureaucrats? These are hardworking individuals, right? And then you drop information like this, and it becomes very clear to the American people that what you're dismantling is not this objective, neutral civil service that only has the interest of the American people in mind. But what you're doing is basically fumigating a just absolute rat's nest of degeneracy, court eunuchs, complete and utter just scum that should not be in anywhere near power, should not be, nobody should be subjected to like what they are doing here in these chat rooms. But certainly it's not something that they should be paid to do as mission critical DEI work in the middle of the federal intelligence agency.
Well, that's certainly true, right? And one of the things that we need to realize in this is that this is very likely not unique, right? That this seems to be the way government agencies work, right? This does not seem to be an isolated case. Now, obviously, it's particularly severe because this is allegedly the very serious part of government, right? But if we're looking for action items on how can we grade Trump, right? Well, how is he actually doing? Basically, it is determined by how much he can actually carve out of the deep state, because this stuff matters, right? Politics is a serious game. Power politics is, it's not easy, and you can't waste time on, random garbage like this, right? This is not something that a serious country does, let alone allegedly the most powerful, prosperous nation in the world, right? Our ancestors did not waste time on stuff like this. And again, right, if we want to actually, make America great again, well, this is something that will have to go. And to give Trump credit, right, he's done yeoman's work. He's been going in there with a hatchet and, smashing it. And I will say one more thing. I was reading a little bit of, liberal coverage of this. And one of the things that I thought was particularly funny is people complaining about violating these agents' privacy. And forgive me if I'm not particularly sympathetic to the NSA complaining about their privacy.
The guy's using the Patriot Act to figure every one of the things in your browsing history. Yeah, I'm not particularly worried about the fact that their sex chat got blown open.
Yeah,
Especially when it was
exactly.
on work time and it was affiliated with the DEI efforts of the intelligence community. In fact, the phrase the DEI efforts of the intelligence community is itself the most insane thing you should probably ever utter. But here we are.
Well, definitely. And I don't want to keep going back to, your feud with our mutual friend, academic agent. But, one of the things that, has been an open question is, well, to what degree do the allegedly serious parts of government, right, the hard power, to what degree do they buy into this ideology? And it seems like the answer is a lot. Like they really buy into it to the point where they are getting, shall we say, somewhat uncomfortable elective surgeries and lasering their buttholes. There's a certain amount of commitment there.
Yeah, if that doesn't prove religious commitment, then we're out of ways to do that.
Exactly. Right. Just an aside.
Yeah, no, and to be clear, it's not a feud. It was a bet, and it is over. That said, it is very clear that there's a mix of things happening. Like Joy Reid is, getting fired from MSNBC. You've got, Jeff Bezos talking about how he's going to trim the opinion columns at the Washington Post to not be quite so radically liberal. We'll see how much that actually gets done. But simultaneously, we get stuff like this uncovered. So it's clear that some aspects of the ruling elite are attempting to put the woke away. But I feel pretty safe in my analysis that this is a core doctrine that infiltrated deeply into the more serious aspects of the ruling elite. We're often told that the intelligence agencies were basically the ultimate boss of our elite class. They were the final word in kind of academic agents construction. Like banks and intelligence agencies were basically like the two big bosses. And the fact that they were operating a DEI trans chat for grooming children is like, well, I think they might have believed some of this then. But that said, we have quite a stack of super chats there in front of us, so we should probably get to the questions of the people. Before we do, is there anything you want people to check out, Mr. Burden?
Yeah, so my primary output is the Jay Burden Show, which is an interview show I put out roughly twice a week. I've had Auron on a couple times. So if you want to check out the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Great interviews over at the Jay Burden Show. You should most definitely partake. All right, let's see our questions here. Simplar says, today we all learn democracy is orgies. The more orgies, the more democracy. I mean, to be fair, there's a certain level of internal coherence to that argument, as disgusting as it might be. Let's see here. Philosophical Thirstworm says, well, this explains all the mysterious deaths and suicides at Fort Bragg. Need a renaming again to Fort Brack. One thing we didn't mention that I meant to was that the fact that these kind of radical sexual escapades used to be key flags, like red flags for being screened out of intelligence work, right? Because one of the key things when it came to intelligence work is you can't be blackmailed. You can't be blackmailable. So having a high degree of debt, like a gambling habit, a wild sexual perversion, like these are all things that basically barred you from working in the intelligence community because it made you very vulnerable to human intelligence actions. So people could pressure you, they could get photos, this kind of thing. And it seems like the way that the American Intelligence Agency basically decided to get over this hurdle was just to make sure everybody was doing it. Like you couldn't be blackmailed with it because it was actually something to be proud of, something to be celebrated, something to be preferred if you were doing. That actually seems to be the way that they kind of more or less averted what was the problem of the blackmail based on these kind of sexual activities.
Well, and I think that there's another contributing factor, which is how often are these type of sexual perversions the only thing going on, right? Like how long is that how often is that simply, that's where it stops. Yeah. And, obviously I know nothing about, certain events at Fort Bragg, but I'll put it this way. I have a feeling that if you dug into these 100 people, you'd find a lot more. If this is what they're saying at work, who knows what they're doing when they're in the privacy of their own home.
I've got a sign that I tap about this on a pretty regular basis that I think would apply. I think as educated guess, like you said, no hard proof immediately, but I think that's a pretty safe assumption. John Carter here says, I always appreciate when you have a subject matter expert on for the topic at hand. Jay, do you feel like you're particularly qualified on the intelligence community or the other stuff in this one?
Well, as a long-standing policy of mine is to confirm all rumors. My only answer is yes.
Yeah, there you go. Line Drinker says, keep up the great work, gents. Thank you, man. It's been a long time. Actually, Line Drinker has been around since the very beginning of the channel when I had like maybe 500 subscribers or less. So good to see you, man. Appreciate you stopping by. Michael Robertson says, in cultural revolutions, people swap their old uniforms for an ascendant uniform. These people make permanent changes to their identity as woke forever. What happens after the woke, and what do they do? Yeah, that is actually a really critical thing, right? This is a burn the ships, burn the bridge type scenario, right? The reason that you have people buy into an identity like this, it is very hard, if not impossible, to completely reverse. So when you make this kind of commitment, you're not just getting a tattoo, even, you're doing something that is irrevocably changing your body, and even with the best efforts of surgeons and such, is going to leave very serious side effects, probably make you dependent on chemicals and care for life. So if you just pivot away, this is again one of those reasons I was always pretty skeptical that we could just easily discard all this stuff. Once you've encouraged so many of these people to buy in, what do they do after? Are they just the walking wounded? Are they basically like the victims of out of control, psychological experiments from years gone by? What happens to these people if we truly move on from this insane moment?
Well, I think that similarly to my point about, how we can grade Trump, I think that this will be kind of a leading indicator that, the changes Trump have wrought are permanent and lasting, right? That we will start to see defections. Now, obviously, we'll probably start to see them from kind of, the rightward edge of, the liberal coalition. That seems to make sense. But, these people, like you've said, I don't know if there is any going back for them because they have permanently and irrevocably bought in, right? There's no way to go back. And while certainly there are people who detransition, there's a vanishingly small minority, even of, a minority, right? And while it certainly is possible, right, it happens, and I wish it would happen more, I think that these people are likely, they're lifers, right? They are fully and totally ideologically committed soldiers.
Yep, I think unfortunately that's exactly true, which is why they put this purity test in there in the first place. Robert Weinsfeld bringing the Beaver Gang, representing them here for Mr. Burden. Appreciate that, sir. Tiny Rick, how do you guys suggest I go about exposing my left-wing family members and friends to this story and others like them? Should I even bother? This is something I try to stress. Like, they're going to be in a scenario now where preference cascades are going to start working on these people, right? Like the elite signaling, I think, is changing. Even the focus of the media is changing. Obviously, the people in power are changing. And so a lot of these people who are kind of fair weather, well, this is where power lies. This is what makes my life easier. I'll go along with this. They're going to be naturally kind of predispositioned to follow down the path of kind of changing their ideology here. And so to some extent, you don't have to push extremely hard. You can have stories like this in your back pocket. You should, so that if they challenge you on an issue, you can say, hey, here's this, here's what's going on. Obviously, we should be able to disagree with this, right? However, I wouldn't go hard in the paint, right? You're kind of in the last few miles of this in a lot of ways. And so pushing too hard on this stuff ultimately probably doesn't do a whole lot. If they're so dedicated that even after kind of the ideological shift, the shift in kind of cultural momentum, all the stories coming out, if they're still deeply bought into that ideology, then you're probably not going to just argue them out of it. Like, more has to change in their life. The incentive structures have to change before they're going to probably flip. So again, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the arguments chambered. You shouldn't know where this stuff is so you can present it if they need it. But ultimately, I wouldn't burn friendships or family connections over this, especially at this point. Because, you know, if they were gonna like not spend, you know, if they're like, oh, you're conservative, I can't be associated with you. Well, no loss on your part, right? But if they were someone who is still hanging around, still being part of your life, and now they're seeing kind of the weight of all these changes fall on top of them, they might be closer to flipping on their own than you think.
Well, and my perspective on this, right, is we've been using religious language to talk about this. And I think that that's very apt in this circumstance. Are there people who are converted by a crazy guy on the street corner yelling at them, you know, repent or you'll go to hell? Yes, that does happen. But also, the vast majority of people find that kind of unsettling because the problem is when you're changing allegiances, whether it is religiously or politically, there's a certain amount of that that's kind of embarrassing, right? That person is basically admitting they're wrong. And so oftentimes a lighter touch is warranted. And particularly like a story like this is outrageous, right? It's a punch in the face. And, you know, oftentimes those are the issues that can, you know, cause people to put up their defenses. And so in general, there certainly is a place for rhetoric. This might be one of those stories you send to your buddies and not to your liberal aunt.
Yeah. Global Limburg says, Rufo answers Elon and reveals 5 bullet points on what government workers did last week. Yeah, in case you didn't know, Elon Musk kind of did this basically pulse check on the federal bureaucracy saying, send me an email with the 5 bullet points that you have accomplished this week. What do you do, right? They're the Bobs from Office Space. What would you say you do here? This is a question that basically every average person has to answer on a regular basis in their work, and asking it of government employees is entirely reasonable. Unfortunately, as you point out, Rufo kind of brings us light on what they are actually doing, and it is every bit as horrible, if not more, than we thought. Creeper Weirdo says, Auron, did you see AA's video on the woke getting put away? It's pretty good, actually, and has an interesting critique of the war on faith meme. Possible conversation, perhaps. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. I haven't seen that video yet, but I'll see what he has to say about that. Maybe we can get into it a little deeper. Again, I would like to remind people that Academic Agent and I are friends. We agree on a good bit about how politics works. We just had a simple disagreement on one mechanical aspect of political operation. It's a significant one, but we're not in some kind of death struggle ideologically here. We're pretty much on side here. Elijah Timon says, you don't understand. There aren't real gay people, not like the ones on TV in the 90s played by straight actors. I know how the real world is. Yeah, it is. Once again, interesting how many people will ignore, and unfortunately, probably quite a number of Republicans, conservatives, will ignore the kind of inevitability that this kind of thing was produced. The actions and allowances that got us here are pretty obvious, but the slippery slope remains undefeated, right? And this is unfortunately something that even the right at this point is often ignoring. Tiny Rick says, allow me to play devil's advocate for a moment and suggest that the lasering of the Troon's butthole is, in fact, a matter of national security. JK, to be right-wing is not to be insane, and great show and guests. Thank you very much, man. I don't know. What kind of lasers are they deploying? Is it very sensitive intelligence? It's certainly a sensitive area. I don't know.
I mean, who knows? Maybe this is what Reagan's Star Wars program was, right? It was not building space lasers to fight the Russians. It was for, a perfectly smooth finish.
Yeah. The most important technological development of our lifetime. Yeah. The real Star Wars. Zhang Yi says, Jay Burden is a notorious polygamist. Tread lightly. We still confirming all accusations?
I think I got to do it. That's me.
That's the deal. All right. Continuing forward, Glorified Gardens says Jay Dyer talks about how the deep state preferred degenerates for spies and operatives as they're easy to blackmail or compromise, at least used to be. You probably submitted this after we already discussed that, but yeah, absolutely. That was a basic standard in the intelligence community. One of the reasons you didn't put people with these proclivities in important positions is that it was easy to flip them. You get a couple compromising photos for a guy who's got, the passwords to a specific satellite. You show up, and or email it to him or whatever, and he ends up becoming a double agent. This is a classic trap that was used by intelligence services all the time. So yeah, maybe the technological update, or I guess the social technology that you're using here to try to get around that is you just make everyone a degenerate and make it normal, or make it even laudable, and then you don't have to worry about the blackmail aspects.
Well, and this is, I cannot remember his name, but one of the longest running Russian moles in the US government who, sent just droves of information to the Soviets. He was compromised because he was a closeted homosexual. Uh, Again, this was during the 70s and 80s when that was majorly taboo. And that's how he flipped, right? And obviously, shall we say, social attitudes have changed, but the very basic piece of wisdom that people in charge of secrets shouldn't have compromising hobbies, it seems to have been lost.
Yeah, it was a pretty obvious thing, pretty standard practice for a very long time, and yet here we are. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. If you are not watching The Jay Burden Show or following him on Twitter, obviously you need to fix that now. If it's your first time on this channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe on YouTube, click the bell, notifications, all that, so you know when our streams are going live. If you'd like to get the podcast as a broadcast, you need to go to, I did that backwards, but anyway, if you would like to get this show as a podcast, you need to go to your favorite podcast platform and go ahead and subscribe. If you do, go ahead and leave a review, a recommendation, a rating. It helps with the algorithm. I want to thank everybody for watching, and as always, I will talk to you next time.